about 260 kilometres south of Lima. On a peninsula jutting out into the sea, there's a huge headland called Cerro Colorado. Now, in the mid-1920s, Peruvian archaeologist Julio C. Teo made his way here on the trail of looted artefacts that had turned up in Lima. These artefacts that he'd seen in Lima were some of the greatest artistic achievements he'd seen yet in all of his time studying Peruvian prehistory. These were the Paracas textiles, still generally considered the most incredible textiles ever found in the New World, and some of the greatest ever made by human hands. Out there on the remote southern coast of Peru, where the desert meets the sea, Teo stumbled upon more than he could ever have imagined in his wildest dreams. In a number of locations, all around Cerro Colorado and the neighbouring coastal regions, Teo found a whole collection of necropolises, burial grounds of the ancients, hundreds upon hundreds of burials, with gold work, textiles, pottery, and skeletons within. There was so much stuff, so much material in these graves, that Teo was able to christen an entirely new archaeological culture, naming it after the village nearby. This is the story of the Paracas culture, one of the most incredible in all the New World, and one of the most unique in the entirety of human history. Julio C. Teo is one of these larger-than-life characters that jumps out of the pages of the history books, like an Indiana Jones of Peru. Born into poverty in the mountains as a second-class citizen because of his native roots, due to his sheer curiosity, he managed to rise to the very forefront of intellectual life in Peru. Absolutely great guy. Look into him if you haven't heard about him, it's an incredible story. Before he even got to Paracas, Teo had made so many incredible discoveries. Most notably at Chavin, which is this incredible archaeological site up in the highlands, regarded by many as kind of ground zero for Peruvian civilization for 100 years and more, until even earlier things have been discovered in the last 50 years. So Chavin was long considered the place where everything began in Peru, where civilization coalesced, where so many of these pan-Andean ideas would begin, showing up for thousands of years in all the cultures that came after. So Chavin begins up in the highlands round about 1000 BC, and the years thereabouts. Now, Teo was very interested in Paracas because it almost follows on from Chavin. You can see the Chavin influence, so there may well have been people coming down from the mountains to this area by the coast. But it was something new as well. So Teo discovered two main areas of tombs at Paracas. To begin with, there was Paracas Cavernous. These are kind of shaft graves, like you can see at many other places all over the world, where mummy bundles were essentially chucked in and the people interred there, hundreds and hundreds of them. And these mummy bundles are just incredible in themselves. It's a mummified body. The earliest mummies in this part of the world come from Chile 7,000 years before. Really early mummification process in this part of the world, completely independently of Egypt and anything like that. So these mummy bundles, you have a mummy wrapped in textiles, gold work, pottery, beads, shells, all sorts of grave goods inside, perhaps to accompany them to the afterlife, perhaps to placate their spirit and keep them happy so they didn't come back and haunt the people on the ground. In many Andean societies, the spirit does not in fact leave the earth to go to a spirit world. It will stay on the earth. And you see this most notably in the Inca and the Wari empires, where mummies were put in their own sort of temples essentially, and people continued to pray to them and essentially treat them as a member of the family. They'd put down food for them and drink for them and eat with them for forever. And we don't know whether this was the kind of thing going on at Paracas. We don't know whether these people were intended to go to the next world or whether they would stay in this world. But the mummy bundles themselves are super interesting. There's some scholars see them as kind of like the shape of a seed, maybe symbolising rebirth, new life, regeneration. So, the Paracas cavernous is from around 1000 to 500 BC. After that, Teo defined the Paracas necropolis, which was from around 500 to 200 BC. And these are much more ornate tombs, essentially. It's a development of the people who came before. Also covered in incredible textiles, also covered by all these grave goods. And now, one of the most interesting things about all of these people who are interred here is that almost all of them have very unusual skulls. The craniums of these people could only have been altered from the very day that they were born, is what many scholars think. And they look like they've got too much skull. Like, this doesn't look like a normal skull, you know, and of course, all sorts of ancient aliens theorists and all these guys have had a field day about these Paracas skulls. The reality is that humans all over the world, in all different periods of history, have practiced cranial modification. So, binding the head of a baby, as soon as it's born, you can create some extraordinary shapes. And these guys, they must have looked interesting. That's all I can say. They must have looked pretty interesting. Imagine coming across a guy with a head this tall, you know? Anyway, was it only the elites that were doing this? Maybe. But there's also some evidence that everybody may have been doing this. It may have been a culture-wide phenomenon. But unfortunately, the jury is still out. You know, it's one of the incredible things about these people is that really not a huge amount is known. We know nothing of the history. Their culture ended in the years before Christ, so 2,000 years ago. No stories survive from that time. What we do have, however, is iconography. Because more so than any other people in the New World, the mythology, you could say, has been preserved to some extent. We can see what these people chose to preserve in the textiles. And there's all sorts of interesting things. Some of the figures look straight out of Chavin. Others are completely new. There's many flying figures. Unmistakably they're flying. Are they gods? Are they monsters? Are they people in costume? We don't know. But it all seems a little bit shamanic to me. You see these kind of things all over the world in all different cultures, from Göbekli Tepe to Siberian shamans, all the way through to the Maya at the time of the conquest. These could be shape-shifting shamans going to some sort of other world to intercede with the divine, to bring something back to help humanity, to help their people. But it's all speculation. This is the great thing. This is the great thing about this. So, these Paracas people are interred in these huge family mausoleums all over the place, all over Cerro Colorado. You can't visit the actual graves anymore, but I was lucky enough to go to Paracas back in 2023, and it was one of my favourite places in all of Peru. The little hotel that I stayed in had its own private museum on site, which was absolutely unreal. Just let yourself in with the key card. I thought it was just a regular hotel, and then that happened. And the museums in that area as well have some amazing artefacts to see. If you're ever in Peru, make sure to go to Paracas, make sure to try and go to Ica. If you're on the way to Nazca, they're all in the same kind of region. So, what do we know about Paracas culture in general? Well, a little bit. Since Teo's day, 100 years ago, quite a lot of archaeology has been done. Many archaeological sites have been investigated. Unfortunately, just 10 years after Teo finished with Paracas, merciless looting took place. So in the 1930s, in the Great Depression, this place was ravaged, and there's far more items in private collections than there are in regular museums for us to go and see, because thousands and thousands of artifacts were sold on the black market. Unfortunately, it's the same for most cultures in ancient Peru, with many archaeologists lamenting that they very rarely see a non-looted site, almost everywhere pockmarked with these looting holes. So just off the coast of Paracas, the village where my hotel was located and where generally people go visit today, there's a boat ride that you can do out to the Ballestas Islands. And these are incredible. They're absolutely coated in seabirds and seals and sea lions and just life in general. They're like a mini Galapagos Islands is how they're pitched. And you go out there and you see these islands absolutely covered in guano, which essentially is bird poo. And what this bird poo does is act as incredible fertilizer. There was actually a war between Peru and Chile back in the late 19th century over this guano, because it's such good fertilizer. At the time, they were exporting it all over the world for agricultural use. And it's almost certain this would have been why the Paracas people were here, because this is a desert. There's nothing else here besides sea life, seabirds, and this guano, which they could use. They could bring it further inland to irrigate, to help with the production of food in their fields. But aside from that, it seems that the Paracas necropolis was just that. This was a place for the dead. This was a religious place where people would be interred. But there are many other sites where Paracas people lived, over quite a large area. Now, we don't think these guys were unified kingdoms as such. What they probably were was a collection of tribal chiefdoms, essentially, united by a common culture and probably a common religion. Maybe the sort of thing that had begun at Chavin all those centuries before. So there's kind of a priesthood dictating religious life. And there are some really interesting places. There's even a small pyramid at one of these sites, surrounded by agricultural lands, which may have been kind of a proto-urban environment. And for the most part, this was a hard place to live. The Paracas people didn't live easy lives. This is one of those areas on the planet where it's quite remarkable that such an advanced society did form. Like Sumer in ancient Mesopotamia and many other places around the world, it may have been the pure harshness of the environment that made people come together to get by and to overcome the harshness of this life that they had to lead here. But one of the great ingenious creations of the Paracas people were their irrigation methods. So using this guano and also generally any water that they could find, they grew crops. They were maize growers, they ate corn, as well as a wide variety of other resources. So these desert farmers did all they could to irrigate the land adjacent to their rivers in this area. It's a desert area, but there are rivers that run down from the Andes. They dry up for much of the year, but generally you can find some water, and it's a case of utilising that water to your advantage. And one aspect of Paracas life that is pretty interesting, it's pretty different to a lot of other cultures, is headhunting. Whether this was to do with warfare or venerated ancestors is another debate. And there's good evidence for both. Maybe it was used for both at different times. We know that the life force of these people was in their heads. That's what they thought. They thought the life force was in the head, so the spirit was there. If you could take the head, you could have that person, ownership of that person, whether for good means or bad means. And some of these bodies at the Paracas necropolis were buried just a head. Don't know what that's about. Maybe it represented the rest of the body because the rest of the body had been lost. Other times you just have a body, with the head missing. So warfare is likely. particularly by the time these sites are abandoned. So round about 100 BC, something happens with the Paracas, and they leave most of their sites. But what we then see is a population movement, almost certainly, inland. So the culture, in particular, of the Paracas people moves inland into formerly peripheral areas of their territory. And this is where the Nazca people come from. So the Nazca society should really be considered a continuation of the Paracas. They move inland along the riverways into the Palpa Valley, the Nazca Valley, and other adjacent riverways, and they begin their way of life. Now, something that the Paracas have in common with the Nazca is geoglyphs. The Nazca did not come up with these huge artistic depictions on the landscape, but the Paracas did it before them. Just next to the Bayastas Islands, the candelabra, a huge carving on a hillside, is one of the earliest examples of this, but there are many others. So, the Paracas go neatly into the Nazca, seeming to leave behind everything that they had once known to go inland. Whether this was due to environmental catastrophe, drought, something like this, we aren't 100% sure. This is still an area where vast amounts of work still needs to be done. So if you're an archaeologist, go look at the Paracas. Now, back to the skulls. There are hundreds of these things all over the place. There's almost 500 that I'm aware of. Some are in the Field Museum, the Chicago Field Museum in America. Others are in the Ica Museum, some are in the Nazca Museum. They're all over the place. I saw a number on my trip to Peru, and they're incredible. They're absolutely weird things. It makes you think, were these fully functioning people, or were they a bit touched by the gods, let's say? Because their brains were quite deformed by the looks of it. But there we go. Unfortunately, they weren't aliens. DNA has been done. Credible DNA studies have been done, and they're human. Sorry. It would be cool if they were aliens. The Indiana Jones film says as much. The Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull. But the less said about that, the better. And something else that's incredible about the skulls is that many of them show evidence of trepanation. So a hole drilled into the skull for some reason, and many of these people survived the operation. So this is the first that I know of evidence of brain surgery in the Americas. And it may be that this was a result of war injuries needing to be relieved. So a lot of them also have like atlatl bolts smacked at their heads and evidence of being injured in battle. So it may be that these operations were needed to relieve pressure in their heads. And amazingly, a lot of them survived. And of course, the material wealth they leave behind is incredible. The pottery, the gold work, and above all else, the textiles. As I said before, if you get a chance, go and see some of these textiles. There's a great museum in Lima called the Textile Museum, and it's got absolutely loads of them in there, and they're absolutely baffling. These are full individuals, and there's hundreds of them. Some of these kind of blankets, they depict a whole group of sort of shamanistic type figures who look half monster, half human, in some kind of like ritualistic trance. Whether this was like a psychedelic festival going on with people attempting to commune with the gods, we don't know, but that's the kind of thing that was going on in later years, so maybe it was happening here. And something else incredible about the Paracas is that some of the people who were going to go to festivals and things in the Paracas lands came from really far away. Northern Peru, all the way up to Ecuador and elsewhere, things are coming from really far away. Up in the mountains too, and amazingly, in Amazonia. So you have feathers from birds and other items that originate in the rainforest. That's really far away from this place. And it just makes you think, these people were making vast journeys back then. Why? Well, maybe they were making pilgrimages. And there's evidence of feasts going on as well. So religious events, feasts, pilgrimages, psychedelic drugs. Whew, there's a lot going on. Cranial modification. The women had one style of cranial modification and the men had another, is another interesting thing. And they're kind of depicted as such in the textiles as well. So there's that. And the Paracas is super interesting. Professor Edwin Barnhart of the Great Courses Plus, absolute legend, he thinks that the Paracas also have the fanged deity, which is this cat-like spirit which shows up in the Moche, the Nazca, the Inca, all through from Chavin. So he reckons that there may have been this deity which was born maybe in Chavin and carried all the way through. So, don't know for sure, but maybe. Anyway, what do you think? What do you think the cranial modification was done for, and what effect would it have had on the person? Do you think some of them were a bit strange, a bit brain damaged, a bit maybe closer to the gods? Easier to commune with the gods if you had a deformed skull, maybe. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Nice one.